Welcome to our final SGEL lecture for this academic year. We have today Timothée Parrique, who's going to give a lecture by the exciting title of Lighter, Slower, Smaller, Better, the Economics of Degrowth. I see many external participants, so I'll say briefly something about what the SGEL project is. SGEL means Sustainable Global Economic Law. And is a research project here at the University of Amsterdam that brings together researchers across 3 departments, European law, international law, and private law. And our research engages with 2 of what we see the main challenges of contemporary capitalism: high levels of inequality and climate change. And we deal with social justice and environmental justice are interrelated as requiring action beyond the nation state. So we're very happy to have you all here, and you're welcome to stay in touch. Look at our website for the types of activities we do. So we're delighted to have Dr. Timothée Parrique. Timothée is an economist and more broadly a social scientist, currently a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Economics and Management of Lund University in Sweden. His research focuses on the economics of degrowth and how different economic institutions, mostly monetary and fiscal systems, need to change in a degrowth or post-growth society. Timothée is the author of a book, Ralentir ou Périr, l'économie de la décroissance, and he keeps a very lively website, which I invite you to consult, to look at around the themes of degrowth. I want to also say that this lecture is organized thanks to the input of our students who really wanted to hear and discuss these themes, and particularly Eureka and Claudio, who are in the room, who sort of took the initiative of contacting Timothée. Great. So Timothée, the floor is yours. Timothée is going to present for 30 to 45 minutes. I'm not sure exactly. And then there is plenty of time for discussion, questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for welcoming me here. And I'm going to share some dashing slides here. Yes. So, hello, everyone. This is where it all started for me on the left. That's my PhD thesis, which I started in 2016. That's where I started to really look precisely at degrowth. Before, I was mostly looking at ecological economics and more precisely ecological macroeconomics. So that was my specialty. And I wrote this rather lengthy thesis on degrowth, which I've been trying to synthesize into Ralentir ou Périr, l'économie de la décroissance, which I'm very happy was just published in Spanish. And there will be further translation in English, German, Korean, Vietnamese, and a few Portuguese and a few other languages very soon to come. So what I want to do in the time I have today, because I think I want to focus most of that in the questions you might be having. You will soon realize the degrowth field is rather large. So it's an endless pit of wonders, but it's also it's a very wide spectrum of theories and concepts we find in there. So I want to give you an overview, and then don't hesitate to get very precise if there is something you want to know about it. I want to start with this. If you type degrowth on YouTube right now, these are the 2 first videos that pop up. And I think it really captures degrowth as a controversial concept. I mean, look at the first. I don't know if you know John Stossel from the United States, but I think the thumbnail of the video is telling you everything you need to know. You know, it's like degrowth is bad, it's horrible, this evil, dangerous idea. And then second is just the polar opposite, that, you know, why degrowth is necessary. And so degrowth, since its emergence as a concept, has been handled within that polarized debate, with either people not knowing what it is or people intensely hating it and intensely loving it. As a social scientist, I find it interesting, these concepts that are controversial, because I think they just point to something that is valuable to discuss. and this is why I've decided to write my thesis on the topic. This is also why I decided to spend a lot of time studying these actual controversies. Why do people hate degrowth, and why do people love degrowth? And what is that telling us about current debates about social ecological justice? But before we talk about this, let's come back to where it comes from. La Décroissance, and that little magazine, which came out in February 2002. That is the birth of the concept. It's pretty consensual within historians of the field that there's been this kind of divide with the limits to growth debate, the end of the 60s and the 70s and throughout the 80s and 90s. That completely changed at the beginning of the 2000s with the birth of that concept, décroissance, which wasn't used before in critiques of growth. And it wasn't born alone. It was born with adjectives. So it was a degrowth that was a décroissance conviviale, a décroissance soutenable, a convivial and sustainable degrowth. And to bring us back to 2002, we have to understand that the 5 authors which you can see on the right that wrote this kind of like 4 articles on degrowth, they were just aiming at criticizing the doxa of the time in terms of sustainability, which was the concept of sustainable development. And in the way I'm going to define degrowth, you will see that as a concept, it has positioned itself quite differently from sustainable development, borrowing some of its characteristics, but also taking a critical stance toward that concept. So when I talk about this kind of precursors, the genealogy, the ancestors of degrowth as an argument, I'm making a reference to a number of isolated thinkers after the 1950s, but you will see most importantly in the 1970s, that from different perspectives started to problematize capitalism, of course, but that was already an ancient line of critique, but more specifically, growth. So 1972, second row, 4th from the left, we all recognize the Limits to Growth report. But there's been other books that I think we don't often mention. The 1976 Social Limits to Growth, for example, by Fred Hirsch, developing an argument that they were not only biophysical obstacles to an infinitely growing economy, but also social factors that would limit the growth of an economy. There's been the work of Herman Daly, which I've been using a lot in my thesis, the American ecological economist, who was already talking in the 1970s about steady state economics. So trying to develop the vision of an economy that would have achieved some kind of biophysically optimal scale. And so imagining that Herman Daly was talking about uneconomic growth to make the difference between economic growth, so a growth that is bringing more benefit than cost, that's why it should be declared economic, and uneconomic growth, so additional production that would bring more cost than benefits. And so Herman Daly, from the perspective of ecological economics, was arguing that high-income nations were experiencing uneconomic growth because they were producing and consuming more, but at the cost of huge volumes of social and ecological costs that were actually more important than its financial benefits. There were a bunch of thinkers using the idea of proportion. You can see Leopold Kohr in the 1957, The Breakdown of Nations. So Leopold Kohr is a fascinating economist / sociologist because he developed a theory of size. I don't think his theory is very convincing in the 1977 book, but he's basically arguing like as soon as something gets too big, it gets bad. Whatever you think, a company, a city, a country. But he inspired at least 2 people you can find here, Ivan Illich and Ernest Friedrich Schumacher. You can see them actually second row. Tools for Conviviality for Austrian philosopher Ivan Illich, and Small is Beautiful from Ernest Friedrich Schumacher. And these two people, they took the same idea from Leopold Kohr to say that, like, well, you know what? Our problem today, the way we can frame sustainability, is that our economic system, with its kind of focus on infinite growth, it tends to just lose proportion with the pace and size of ecosystems. And so Small is Beautiful is really a plea for just economies that remain in proportion with their environments. I mean, in modern term, we could use sociologist Hartmut Rosa. He talks about resonance, to have like an economy that will be resonant with its social and ecological environment. So just to say that there were a bunch of ideas, but they were all developed individually, in the sense that these people, they did not congregate every year into a conference talking about whatever concept. They didn't have a concept in common. What changed in 2002 is that these people you can see on the right, and many others after, they've just been compacting all of these ideas into one concept, arguing that, you know what, degrowth is all of those people, what they were talking about is basically something we can call degrowth. And that gave rise to the modern literature. Some of you may have read already a bunch of books. I realize you don't have the dates here, but if you haven't read any of them, I invite you to look at the third row, and you see something very yellow, something very green, and then something blue, white, and red. That's the latest, The Poverty of Growth by Olivier de Schutter. So those are my three favorites, if you want to start. The Future is Degrowth, Less is More, and The Poverty of Growth. But what I wanted to show with all these books, more than just giving you reading recommendation, is that degrowth as a paradigm has been evolving and now comprises these kind of like three waves of ideas. The first limits to growth wave from the 70s, using, of course, a few ideas from before, and which has been continuing in the 80s and 90s. The birth of décroissance, which was very French focused in the 2000s, and then the translation of décroissance into degrowth at the end of the 2000s that gave rise to a third wave, an academic wave this time, because in the 2000s, there were no scientific literature on degrowth. There were no researchers of degrowth. There was no research degrowth studies. Now, the difference is that many of these books are written by people like myself, having academic positions and publishing also peer-reviewed articles on the topic. Actually, the number of articles, the first peer-reviewed article about degrowth was published in 2007 in English. And now there are around 1,000 articles, with already like around 80 being published just for 2024. Just to show you that also there's been a change of degrowth starting mainly as a kind of activist political slogan, having turned into different things. It's still a movement, it's still a slogan, but now it's also a field of study, which, as we can expect, has attracted more and more thinkers, more and more publications, and therefore it is fair to assume more and more ideas. That's also something I've been trying to defend very often, is that degrowth as a paradigm has been evolving. But enough about this. I just want to make the first big conceptual division between degrowth, as you hear, as a kind of a critical theory. What degrowth is, first and foremost, a critique of economic growth, and more precisely, a critique of what historian Matthias Schmelzer calls the hegemony of economic growth. So degrowth pinpoints our modern obsession for economic growth. If you're looking for proof of this obsession, don't look very far. Economic growth is very often mentioned in the news during debates on pick whatever topic: health, immigration, war, ecology. You will have an economist that will tell you about GDP. You will have an economist that will tell you about the economy. Some people call it economicism. So these kind of hegemony in general of economic affairs over all other kinds of decisions. So that's the Sustainable Development Goal number 8, which states decent work and economic growth. This is the Green New Deal from the European Commission in 2019, which when you watch the 1 minute, 22 seconds video, the first thing it tells you, like 11 seconds into the thing, it's a new growth strategy, which is strange because, you could have framed it the way you want. It's a new prosperity strategy. It's a new sustainability strategy. It's a new, whatever, but it's a new growth strategy. As a social scientist here, we should take this as evidence that somehow we have a sweet spot collectively, or modern society give a lot of importance to that idea of growth. And if we find that this focus on growth is problematic, that means that concept that takes this as a point of departure for critical theorizing is interesting. And I give you a difference with classical Marxian critiques of capitalism, which have many things in common actually with degrowth as critical theories. But Marxians, they take capitalism as a departure point to criticize contemporary economies. But, it's not very often somehow that people talk about capitalism. You don't have politicians during elections saying we need more capital accumulations. You don't have the press openly defending the interest of capitalists, and you don't have the European Commission telling us that, we need to have more capital. So capitalism is a bit of that shows us the kind of difference. Like economic growth, it's a very everyday term. People even have formed opinions about economic growth. And so that's why I'm justifying here that it's an interesting point of departure to enter into the economy. Another example, the Global Resource Outlook from UNEP and the International Resource Panel, which is one of the most powerful publication, you could say, in sustainability science/politics. And you can read the executive director. So that report is from last month or the month before. And in that one pager, again, we could talk about many things, but the first thing it shows that it is both possible and profitable to decouple economic growth from environmental impacts and resource use. So here it shows precisely, the goal, the way we frame sustainability is we need to clean economic growth. So degrowth position itself as like, but what if, the very objective of economic growth was not only biophysically unsustainable, but also a mismeasure of prosperity. So other evidence is this way of framing issues I often find in the news where, when something happens, it's a risk for economic growth, like climate change, like we're somehow losing the stability of the climate system. And what we're worried about is its impact on GDP, which is a kind of magical number we calculate about the circulation of money we print ourselves, which, again, as a social scientist, is telling us something about the way we frame the environmental crisis. Degrowth people will tend to say that, oh my God, economic growth is harming the climate. But here, the kind of mainstream economicist vision of sustainability is just climate change is harming economic growth. You can see how it's perfectly reversed. What I want to do now is just to give you a definition of degrowth. It's from a paper that is currently under review where I've been analyzing 115 definitions of degrowth from the literature. Nothing too complicated. I've looked at these definitions and I've identified features. The first feature you find in definitions of degrowth is, this kind of main thing it is as a strategy. And here I'm passing on the first step of saying whether it's a concept, a theory, a movement, whether it advocates or recommends or urges. Let's just focus on degrowth as a phenomenon. And that phenomenon, that is degrowth, is first and foremost a downscaling of production and consumption. And that's very important to have these two. At that level, if we already talk about a downscaling of production and consumption, that's the very same of any recession or, it's just less production and consumption. So it's not very specific. And we'll see that what makes degrowth useful as a concept is that it is much more specific than that. And yeah, before continuing, I should say that the two things I've been presenting there, they run in parallel. degrowth is both a critical theory, a critical paradigm, and also a strategy, something that could be observable in an economy. And both of them are discussed like in parallel in the literature. So here I wanted to present you both to see that they coexist. It's not either or. Some people use it as a critical theory. Some people use it as a kind of theory of transition. So downscaling of production and consumption. And then in the definitions, I've noticed that they systematically add several features. And these features are, I've summed it up to 4 features in that paper. The first one is sustainability. So what makes degrowth special is that it is a downscaling of production and consumption that is specifically designed to reduce ecological footprints. I've picked one study among many. Perhaps you've seen this one from a few weeks ago, an analysis of EU 27 using donuts, Kate Raworth's donut, where we have this kind of environmental ceilings and social floors, ranking European economies based on their ecological overshoot and social undershoot. So Portugal, for example, is the relatively less unsustainable economy within the EU. Its overshoot is just a bit of over 100%. Ireland is the worst, 479%. So degrowth as a strategy aims at basically pushing all these red bits in. It's a strategy for economies like these high-income economies that do not manage somehow to get back within planetary boundaries. Economies that have not managed through technological progress, through efficiencies, through circular economy, through green growth, through whatever you want, they've not managed to lighten their ecological footprint. Degrowth offers, let's say, a plan B to be like, you know what, if you've not managed to reduce your ecological footprints fast enough or at all through kind of green growth strategy, actively reducing production and consumption might be a way to reduce ecological footprint. This is kind of the core of what degrowth is about. Then there is this idea of democratic planning, which you find in definitions that talk about, it's self-organized, it's voluntary, it's peer governance, it's democratically led. There are many different ways of saying it, but basically it means that it's not accidental. It is intentional. It's a transition strategy somehow. And we'll see that this kind of democratic aspect is fundamental for the 2 others characteristics, which I will soon show, which is social justice and well-being. Then, of course, like the idea of democratic planification is a problem in itself. What does it mean? Well, people have different definitions. How should it be organized? Should it be just, is the French, for example, Citizen Convention for Climate, an example of democratic planning? Some people disagree, but the idea of degrowth, at least in theory, is that this kind of downscaling of production and consumption involves specific choices. What should we produce and consume less of? What should we produce and consume more of? How do we make the divide between essential and non-essential? I don't think this can be done like in just broad theory. This needs to be done through discussions, compromise, politics, deliberation, hence the idea of democratically planning. Third aspect, social justice in a way that is equitable. So the phrases you see on the right is the way I've decided to word the definition. And I've carefully thought about this to try to have something that is both simple and clear. So every word I've reflected on, but if that can also be a matter of disagreement, if you think that definition is too narrow or not exhaustive enough, do feel free to tell. So in a way that is equitable, there's many ways of talking about degrowth in relation to social justice. There's the justification of why high-income countries should consider reducing production and consumption. Very often, the argument runs like this. Today, when you look at ecological footprint, they are heavily correlated with wealth levels and income. So for climate change and global carbon inequality, you see that the top 10% richest people, and I think now people are very familiar with these numbers, they own most of the world wealth, 76%. They emit most of the carbon, almost half of total emissions, and they will bear very little of the climate cost. Situation is completely opposite for the bottom poorest half of humanity. And so therefore here the argument is degrowth is a selective strategy in the sense of like, it should start to be organized by these countries that have overshot planetary boundaries, but also they're the richest. And even within a specific country, we should have a very socially selective way of determining, you know, who should consume and produce less. It's not like an aggregated where we do averages. It is something that have to tap into the very origin of ecological footprint. If there are environmental inequalities, it means the ecological transition will have to require different orders of magnitude of changes from different people. It's very easy. You know, if you're an average American and you consume, you have like a yearly carbon footprint of 16 kilos, 16 ton, then you will have to just, you know, do much more efforts to reduce it than if you're already at like 5 ton or 3 tons. So I don't want to get too locked into carbon thinking, but it's just to show you that, let's say, the magnitude of degrowth depends of both the overall level of overshoot, that gives you how much you need to produce and consume less, but the way you split that kind of effort depends on another stratification, which is often one of a mix between economic and environmental inequality. And the last one is while securing well-being. And I've thought very hard about how to phrase this, whether we should talk about like improving happiness or about satisfying needs or securing well-being. I think securing well-being is rather safe. Degrowth is demanding enough as a transition. I think it's very risky to say that somehow degrowth is a perfect recipe for happiness. It is a rather disruptive societal transformation. If that can happen while just maintaining average living standards, meaning, you know, bringing the poorest, most vulnerable people up to the average, even if that means, you know, reducing the living standards of the wealthiest, that will already be enough. And so the idea of securing well-being, I think, is it reflects what you find in these definitions, you know, improving quality of life, decent life for all people, holistic objectives of human well-being, this idea that somehow this transformation is not just a sacrifice for sustainability or justice or, you know, something to be organized just for the sake of being democratic. And this is why I decided to put well-being last. It is like degrowth as a transition is meant to somehow transform our system so that in the very long term, and even in the short term, it is more fitted to satisfy well-being for all within planetary boundaries. Some of you that love to read IPCC report will have noticed I've been stealing their catchphrase, well-being for all within planetary boundaries, but that's precisely what we're talking about here. Degrowth, you could see, is the kind of big macroeconomic rationing mechanism at the level of the world, where we're realizing we have finite biophysical budgets, we have already overstretched some of them, a minority of already rich people are just overusing these budgets. We have to talk about sharing these budgets more equitably. And that might mean, yes, producing and consuming less in already rich countries to liberate resources for communities, not only countries, but communities who today struggle to have a decent lives without the infrastructure, an infrastructure that surely will require the mobilization of natural resources, which won't be available if they are being used by rich communities to keep growing more. So the way of this kind of like well-being focused, there's another way of using it. I'm sorry, this figure I realize, which I made a bit hastily, is perhaps not the best, but that's what I meant is, as economists, basically our mission is to ensure that the economy is efficient or just even effective and efficient in turning natural resources into well-being. Once you've realized your economy is too big and you have to make the choice to produce and consume less, then you have to kind of rank the different stuff you're using. And that's the ranking on the left. You can see on the vertical axis between, goods and services that are fundamental, whatever, like water, medicine, clothes, heating, these stuff you cannot live without. And stuff that are pretty much accessory or useless, just having a new smartphone every year or whatever, just like taking a flight for a weekend holiday somewhere. So I think individually we're used to rank this stuff because we don't have an infinite purchasing power. So you're ranking, basically you're rationing your purchasing power and you're choosing what is most fundamental to you. Well, macroeconomically, though, we're not used to do that. Degrowth is basically applying the same logic, but macroeconomically, and saying we have a very finite biophysical budget. So we're going to try to phase out the useless, especially if that useless is very polluting. If it's useless and not polluting, well, it can be ignored. But if it's useless and extremely polluting, then that means it's a very good candidate for degrowth. On the other hand, if it's fundamental and least polluting, then that's something we don't have to worry about. So starting like this helps us to divide a bit, like which goods and services, which sectors are problematic and which others are less problematic. And that also can have a different strategy. So you see the avoid box, the red box, stuff that are extremely polluting and not very essential. These that can be avoided somehow. Compared to the blue box, stuff that are still very polluting, but fundamental, essential, and important. These stuff you just cannot avoid. So you have to use a different strategy. Maybe this thing we better share, or we substitute. We still need to move around, but we don't do it with a car or a plane. We do it with a train. And then we improve. We do it, maybe we do with a car that we share among a high number of people, but that car is not like a fossil-based enormous SUV. It's a small, efficient electric car. So here you have this triad we find in the IPCC report: avoid, substitute, improve. So dividing the debate here from the lens of well-being shows us that, degrowth is not this kind of general, we stop everything at first. It needs to be very selective on both these aspects, on the spectrum of what is heavy in the ecological footprint and what is heavy or light in the well-being footprint. So to articulate, I also like to somehow differentiate degrowth as a transition, because the way I've been defining it, so as a phenomenon, it's temporary. If you decrease production and consumption, you will hit zero. So that's not the goal. The goal is just to have this temporary phase of economic contraction. We've seen it, it's selective, it's democratically planned, it's done equitably, whatever, to get back within planetary boundaries. Once you're there, back in the green, you need to shift mindset. You don't fall back into a growth mindset, otherwise we will re-experience ecological overshoot. But you don't stay in the degrowth mindset either. You transition to what could be called a steady state mindset, or what some people call a post-growth mindset, which very technically should be called the post-degrowth mindset. But anyway, that's a moment where you say, okay, now we're back within planetary boundaries. We still need to have a well-being economy that operates within planetary boundaries, but sometimes if a need emerges, it means we can produce and consume a bit more using a bit of the available biophysical budget. And when that needs disappear, when we experience a bit of technological progress, we can allow ourselves to produce and consume less. You can see the oscillations of regrowth and degrowth. So that's also why that debate can be differentiated into a number of concepts. That the degrowth is, I like to keep it very specifically to describe that ski slope you can see. Whether well-being economy is a perma-circular economy, eco-socialism, steady state, they're very good concepts to describe this kind of destination. How does the economy we're aiming for looks like? And how does it operate in every day? Compared to the degrowth question, which is pretty much how do you contract an economy today, and how do you do this in a way that is democratic, fair, sustainable, and, well, I'm not going to say joyful, but while securing well-being. I'm going to finish with this because I've already overshot my 30 minutes presentation. I just wanted to show you that paper. which we've written with colleagues doing a systematic review of the degrowth literature, paying specific attention to what kind of proposals, to the question of the how. If we look at these 530 proposals we found, we can identify 380 instruments, which I've ordered here in order of frequency, so the most popular first. Is just to show that somehow over the years, as the degrowth literature grew larger, the toolbox of instrument has also gotten larger. And now, this is not something I've published in the paper, but I wanted to show you a way of thinking about this instrument in a dynamic manner. So think about it like this. Today, we have this growth-based economy that is organized around growth. The first thing you can do before even starting to reduce production and consumption is to diffuse these growth pressures. These growth pressures, they happen at many different levels. Think, for example, of advertising, personal pressure. Now, got a bit of a soundtrack from Sandra. Advertising. As a personal pressure, advertising incites people to consume. When people are incited to consume, they're very likely to consume more than they would have consumed without that incitation, that incentive to consume. Same thing for planned obsolescence. If your phone breaks every year, well, you'll buy a new one. If you have a more durable phone that can last 8 years, 5 years instead of 1, then we will need less phone to satisfy the needs of whatever a phone is used for. Same thing, you have pressures that are kind of built in specific institutions. The for-profit company as a business model, for example, or the way a company is financed. If you borrow money from investors that are asking you a specific, very high 2-digit returns on investment, then you will find yourself with the pressure of somehow, making a profit so you can repay your loan towards these investors. So same thing, we can see that our economy today, we can identify many different levels, formal and informal, these kind of growth pressures. And at the level of the government too, I mean, we openly do growth policies, politique de croissance, as we call them in France. So it's the government is actively trying to somehow maximize economic growth to make sure that people produce and consume more. And that needs to change. We need to diffuse them so that our economy loses its propensity to always just produce and consume more. Then we enter a second wave of, let's say, a second compartment in our toolbox, which is instruments to contract your activity. These can be, kind of, I like to think about it as caps. Sustainability science for, let's say, environmental economics and economists participating in sustainability debates, they've been talking a lot about taxes. I think the originality of degrowth is this kind of criticism of market instrument being sometime and most of the time insufficient to reduce ecological footprints. So the need to have more strict thresholds of resource use. So that can be just kind of biophysical caps. Think, for example, about a carbon budget at the level of a country. And then, of course, this can be organized in a different way, being downscaled into specific production caps. Maybe you guys remember the debate last year in the Netherlands about livestock caps. You remember that? So that would be an example of a production cap, to be like, oh, right, livestock is creating a lot of environmental issues. We don't manage, technological progress has not managed to phase them out. And so therefore, the only way of reducing these issues is to cap the number of cows. Same thing about like whether the Schiphol airport. There was also a discussion about like capping the number of flights per day. So, or there can be an airport deciding like we're not gonna welcome like private jets, or a city that decides to ban specific harmful products. So that's how you can translate a biophysical cap or a biophysical limit into production cap. And of course, and that's why we have downscaling in production and consumption, the definition. There's no point capping production if you don't cap consumption. To have a macroeconomic effect, you need to use the two levers at the same time. And then you can use different instruments. So if you reduce the number of flights, and you can also in parallel introduce a progressive pricing as to make sure that somehow access to flying is equitably organized. And so as you cap production, you don't have this rushing effect where the richest people are just going to use all of the available flights. So that's why this kind of consumption policies needs to be thought in correlation with production policies. The third, once you've done this, you've diffused growth pressures, you've started to limit activities. There's a whole array of policies you need to use to make sure that all of that is done democratically in a way that is equitable while securing well-being, because that's not automatic, especially in an economy that has been designed for growth and that has never kind of engaged in a degrowth transition. So in the literature, many of them are discussed, just a few examples here. But think about something very concrete, like we've talked about, for example, capping cows, cow cap. Wow, that's catchy, cow cap. So if you're capping cows, let's say maybe you're going to affect, well, the revenues of farmers that are, whose livelihood depends on selling cows. And so if you cap cows for environmental reasons, okay, but you need to think about a safety net for these people. So that they don't fall in poverty or unemployment, or more precisely, they don't fall in poverty by falling into unemployment. So here again, you can like, okay, we do this, but we also have a job guarantee, or we have some kind of targeted basic income for cow farmers that the time for them to transition to something else. You see how we think about it, like we want to contract production and consumption, and then we want a safety net to make sure that somehow this is done in a way that's secure well-being. And also I've put deliberative forms to show you that it's not specifically in that order, in the sense of like the very decision to cap cows, the cow cap, I'll never get tired of saying cow cap. The cow cap also needs to be decided, like how many cows should we produce? That's a political decision. I mean, it's a scientific estimation of basically what the carbon budget of a country, but it's a political decisions on how to use it. So even the very definition of production caps and consumption caps needs to be done using forums that we need to design. It can be citizen assemblies, can be horizontal cooperatives, can be neighborhood networks, can be whatever you want. Eurovision style voting contest. It's just, it needs somehow to be thought through if we want to avoid, again, I think the main risk of this transition is decisions being made that only represent narrow interest. And in the context of contemporary capitalism, the narrow interest of the minority of wealthiest individuals. I will stop here after 40 minutes. I'm sorry for taking a bit longer, but I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Timothée. This was really